Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Wednesday Night Bible Class. I hope that you have enjoyed your last 2 weeks. I hope that you have been praying and studying and researching, and I hope you did the homework from last week. But if you haven't, I recorded a video reading Lamentations chapter 1. So go check that video out and let's read Lamentations together. But that was the homework for last week. Tonight, we're going to dive into a video by Dr. Chapman called Ancestor Narratives in Genesis. And this is going to begin to tell us the story of the Israelites. We're actually going to dive into the story tonight. But before we do that, I do want to recap of what we have looked at and learned so far. Trusted notes. Everybody should have a notebook. So first, I want to recap what we have learned so far. And so far, we have seen Israel go from the person of Jacob, when Jacob wrestled with God and won. And so he received a new name, and that name was Israel. And then we saw the word Israel as a nation when they became the nation of Israel, the Israelites. And then we saw Israel as a united kingdom, but then a divided kingdom, and then a reunited kingdom. And then we see Israel as a remnant. In lesson 2, we learned about the Babylonian exile and how the exile played a huge role in the Israelites compiling and editing and writing down their most cherished history, their cherished stories that had been passed down from generation to generation. Now, we do know that some of the books of the Old Testament had been written before the exile, but the exile was a time when they were lamenting, they were reflecting, they were thinking about who they were, thinking about who they used to be, wanting to pass down this information to their children, not wanting to lose it. And so scholars believe that the exile is when the Israelites began to, not necessarily began to write down, because they had already started. And then we saw Israel in Babylonia under exile. And what we learned there is that during the exile is when the Israelites, because they had all of these concerns and questions about how to pass down their traditions to their family, and they had concerns about remembering who they were lamenting Jerusalem being destroyed. All of these emotional and tragic things that were going on with them caused them to want to write down their traditions in a more permanent fashion. And so, because there had already been stories and traditions written down, but now they wanted to make it more official, I guess you could say. So, this is when scholars believe they began to compile the old stories that had been written, compile the stories that had not been written yet. And when they began to write these stories down and sort of make them official. And I believe that this is when they began the official, started to officially call these stories and histories and records the scriptures. So tonight we are going to dive into the actual story. We are going to start in Genesis, and we're going to work our way through the actual story of the Israelites. And the video that we're going to watch this evening is called Ancestor Narratives in Genesis, and it is narrated by Dr. Cynthia Chapman. So let's go ahead and get right into that video.
I recently read an article on what factors contribute to a strong family that can face and overcome challenges. The author surveyed results from several psychological studies of children and families. And what these studies have shown is that families that develop a strong family narrative are more resilient. In our next 2 lectures, we will look into ancient Israel's stories of origin. These are the stories that were compiled and edited into a national history after the Judeans had been exiled to Babylonia. In our Bibles, we find these stories in the first 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These books are known collectively as the Torah. Traditionally, and by that I mean for millennia, the authorship of these 5 books has been attributed to Moses. But modern biblical scholarship has posited that there were actually multiple authors, dating to multiple periods. The earliest writings probably date centuries before the exile, and the latest compositions date to the 2nd century BCE, long after the exile. And scholars have come up with multiple ways of trying to conceptualize the complexity of the biblical text. And in this case, we're just talking about the Torah. So one way would be to refer to the Torah as a tell. A tell is a mound that's visible in the surface of the earth. It's a hill, and it's formed by layers upon layers of human settlement, where one set of inhabitants builds upon the ruins of the other. So understanding the Torah as a tell emphasizes the multiple layers of editing that generations have added to the foundational stories. A second way of trying to conceptualize the Torah is to call it a curated artifact. Once the Torah was completed in the form we currently have it, it was not buried in the ground and forgotten, only to be rediscovered later. It has instead been faithfully copied by scribes, passed down through families, read aloud on sacred holidays. So thinking of the Torah as a curated artifact points to its enduring legacy up to the present and emphasizes its status as sacred scripture. But there's another way that we could try and conceptualize the complexity of layering that is the Torah, and that is to think of it as an heirloom, a valued family treasure that takes on new meaning as it is passed from one generation to another. At each moment of generational transfer, decisions were made on what was valuable, what needed to be preserved and passed down to the next generation. And these decisions left some stories untold. And so if we think of the Torah as Israel's family heirloom, we can then consider the Babylonian exile as a point of generational transfer, a time when one part of that family, the Judeans, made decisions about which of their stories to preserve and how to tell them. The fact that the community of Judean exiles included literate scribes, priests, and nobles meant that these stories were not simply told to their children and grandchildren, they were also written down. By the time that the Judean exiles returned to their land, about 3 generations after being in Babylonia, the Torah had become a treasured story of origins, passed down from generation to generation. It had also become authoritative scripture, a story that priests read aloud at the temple during high holidays. The process that led these national family stories to become scripture is murky. But it's clear that the experience of conquest and exile played a defining role because the stories that are preserved in the Torah speak powerfully to a landless people longing for their God to deliver them home. Let's now turn to the broad outlines of that story. The Torah narrates a history of about 3,000 years, from creation of the entire universe to the arrival of the Israelites at the banks of the Jordan River, where they prepare to cross and take the promised land of Canaan. Within this story, certain periods of history are rushed, condensed into a few chapters, and other periods are slowed down, treated in enormous detail. This change in the pacing of the story shows which periods of history and which stories carried the most cultural weight. In the case of the Torah, the story of Moses dominates 4 of the 5 books in the Torah. And within that story, the episode of Moses receiving the law from God on Mount Sinai is the centerpiece. Second to Moses in emphasis is the family story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This ancestral history occupies most of the book of Genesis. In Genesis chapter
Speaking of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, have you all ever wondered why there's not a lot of story about Isaac? There's the story of Isaac and Rebekah, but there's not a whole lot of story about him. And so I wonder why it's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and maybe not, what about Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph? It seems like Joseph had more of an impact in the story of Israel than Isaac did. And maybe, I don't know, maybe Isaac is just in there because he was in the middle of Abraham and Jacob. But I don't know, I don't know, it just seems like he didn't have that much of a role, other than being the son of Abraham and the father of Jacob. I don't know, just my thoughts.
12, for example, the Israelite God, for reasons that are not stated, chooses one man, Abram, who is later renamed Abraham, to bless in a special way. He asks him to leave his homeland in Mesopotamia and move to the promised land in Canaan, where he will become a great nation, blessed by his God. The Israelite God repeatedly reveals himself to Abraham and to his descendants, Isaac and Jacob. He forms a covenant relationship with Abraham and his descendants. A covenant is a treaty or an agreement between 2 parties. And in this case, where it's between God and Abraham, the 2 parties are not equal because one is a God and the other's a human. So, not surprisingly then, it is the God who initiates the covenant and defines the terms of the agreement. He asks Abraham, "Walk before me and be righteous." And then he promises Abraham, "My covenant," by which he means my special relationship. "My covenant is with you, and you will be the father of a multitude of nations." This covenant is an everlasting covenant that the Israelite God establishes with Abraham and his descendants, in which he promises to be their national God. Finally, God promises Abraham that he will give to him and to his descendants the land of Canaan as an everlasting possession. So far, this covenant seems to be distinctly to Abraham's advantage. He gets a God, a multitude of nations that will trace their ancestry to him. He's blessed, he blesses others, and he is granted an eternal landholding in Canaan. Abraham is asked simply, "Walk before me and be righteous," rather vague and open to interpretation. And as a mark of this covenant, he's asked to circumcise himself and his male descendants. The rest of the book of Genesis narrates the history of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, 4 generations. We often refer to the first 3 men as the patriarchs. And each one experiences divine visitations during which the terms of the Abrahamic covenant are reiterated. "I will be your God, you will be my people. I will bless you, you will become a great nation. I give to you the land of Canaan as an everlasting possession." At the same time, each of these men faces serious challenges that seem to make the promises of land, progeny, blessings, and great nations laughable. First, in terms of progeny, the progeny that are required to make a man into a great nation, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all had wives who were considered barren Abraham waits 25 years from the time that he is first told that he will become a great nation to the birth of the son that God has promised him. Second, in terms of the promised land, the patriarchs seem to spend very little time in it. Abraham arrived in Canaan only to find that there was famine in the land, that it was severe enough that he had to take his family to Egypt and wait it out. Isaac and his wife were also forced to leave the promised land and dwell in the land of the Philistines during a time of famine. Jacob spent most of his adult life back in Mesopotamia working for his father-in-law Laban. And finally, Joseph, as many of us know from the Technicolor Dreamcoat, if not from the Bible, was sold into slavery by his brothers and ended up living out his life in Egypt. A final threat to the promises of the Abrahamic covenant comes in the form of threats to the patriarch's life. And this threat can originate from rival siblings, but just as often, it comes from God himself, the God who has promised to be a covenant partner. So Abraham may actually win the prize for surviving the most threats to his life. He faces down famine, war, angry pharaohs and kings who wish to do him harm. His son Isaac, the one he's waited for forever, is no sooner born to the promise of greatness than God asks Abraham to offer him up as a burnt offering. Jacob's life is first threatened by his brother Esau because Jacob steals Esau's birthright and paternal blessing. But Jacob also experiences a divine threat to his life when he wrestles with God throughout a night, barely surviving and having his hip knocked out of joint. And finally, Joseph is left for dead and then sold into slavery by his brothers, and he's imprisoned in Egypt under false charges. Several of the recurring themes of the patriarchal narratives would speak to the exilic reality of those who are preserving these stories. So first, all of these stories emphasize the Israelite God's presence and power that transcends national boundaries. The special covenant relationship between Abraham's descendants and the Israelite God is continually emphasized. We also find the eternal nature of the covenantal relationship as an emphasis that recurs again and again. And finally, a final emphasis here would be the gift of the promised land, which is an everlasting bequest to Abraham and his descendants. These stories of the patriarchs or the ancestors also acknowledge tensions. These tensions include wives who cannot conceive and children whose lives are threatened. They include a land that is prone to famine and war and a God who does not always protect. Central to almost every aspect of the patriarchal stories is the blessing of children, a blessing that cannot be taken for granted at any period in ancient Israel's history, but to an exilic community that had lost many children through war and likely also through sickness during the long journey into exile. Stories of hard-won children who are born into a land inheritance would speak powerfully. Let's look at the story of Jacob, who becomes the father of Israel, in more detail. Like the exiles, Jacob lived most of his adult life in Mesopotamia, exiled from his family. While in exile, Jacob puts down roots, and he marries 4 women and fathers 12 sons and a daughter. Among Jacob's 12 sons is a man named Judah, who becomes the tribal ancestor of those who are in exile. So I've said before, ancient Israel understood itself through the language of a family. The word that's usually translated as Israelites in the Bible is literally in Hebrew, sons of Israel. In other words, if you ask what it means to be Israelite, it means to be a descendant of Jacob, who's later renamed Israel. Israelites organized their world into a family tree. Nations who were close to them in language and culture, nations like Edom, Moab, and Ammon, were descendants of close relatives, cousins of sorts. The story of Jacob's family provides the basis for how ancient Israel came to understand itself socially and politically as an alliance of 12 tribes. Jacob and his twin Esau are born to Isaac and Rebekah after a period of barrenness. The two men are rivals from the womb, and throughout the childhood and early adult life of these men, Jacob proves himself to be a clever and unscrupulous climber who supplants his older brother as heir. He tricks the witless Esau out of his birthright with nothing more than a bowl of lentils. And then, with his mother's help, he tricks his father Isaac into giving him the blessing of the firstborn that was meant for Esau. Because of the family strife between these two twins, Jacob is ultimately forced to flee his brother Esau and travel to Haran in Mesopotamia, where he finds refuge with his mother's brother, Laban. While in Haran, Jacob ends up marrying both of Laban's daughters, first Leah, the elder, and second Rachel, the younger. The two sisters are then further distinguished in that Rachel is beautiful and she is the loved wife. And Leah, we don't know exactly what this means, but the text says she has weak eyes, and she is the unloved wife.
So part of the homework for next time, because this is something that I've always wanted to look up, is to research weak eyes. And let's see what we come up. People seem to think that it means that she was the not so beautiful one, but I don't know. I don't know. Maybe she had some kind of eye condition. Weak eyes. I mean, why would I don't know. We'll do some research on that and come back.
And then we learn that Leah, the unloved, is abundantly fertile, while Rachel, the loved, is barren. The ancient Israelite understanding of fertility sees God as the one who opens and closes wombs, allowing or preventing conception. So in Genesis 29:31, we read, "When the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren." This scenario of dual marriage then plays out in a kind of birthing war that ensues between the rival sisters. Leah takes the early lead, giving birth to 4 sons in as many verses: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. Rachel, realizing that she is barren, offers her maidservant, Bilhah, to her husband as a wife, so that she might have a child through her. Bilhah bears Jacob 2 more sons, Dan and Naphtali. Now Leah has no intention of losing the lead in this contest, so she too offers her maidservant, Zilpah, to Jacob as a wife, and Jacob apparently is not averse to any of this. He's really very cooperative. Zilpah then bears 2 more sons, Gad and Asher. So at this point, Leah could claim victory.
Is that not crazy? I mean, is that not crazy? Is that not something that could happen in 2023? That is not, I can't have kids, so I'm going to give you, first of all, you marry my sister and then you marry me, and then I can't have kids, so I'm going to give you another wife. And then my sister is like, well, let me give you another wife. No, 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 no.
Spiking the football of progeny, but she manages to bear Jacob 2 more sons herself. First Issachar and then Zebulun, which brings her personal count to 6, with 2 more added from her maidservant. Still not quite finished, we read, afterwards, she bore a daughter and named her Dinah. It is only after all things look hopeless for Rachel, after she has claimed that without children she will die, that we finally read, then God remembered Rachel, and God heeded her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son. She names him Joseph, which means something like, give me another one. Rachel does eventually have a second son of her own, Benjamin, and she dies in childbirth. And so in this manner, the house of Jacob is made up of 2 primary wives and 2 secondary maidservant wives. Each wife seeks to secure and even elevate her status in her husband's house through bearing children. The sons born to these 4 women are not regarded equally, not in the family story and not in the national story that grows out of this family. Sons born to maidservant wives were of a lower status than sons born to primary wives. And firstborn sons stood to inherit the double portion from their father's estate. So in Jacob's house, his firstborn son is Reuben, but it is Joseph, the firstborn of his loved wife Rachel, who inherits the covenantal promises of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Wives, it turns out, can influence the course of history by effectively promoting themselves and their sons. And when we begin to study the history of Israel as a nation and as 2 kingdoms, north and south, we will find that the divisions within the house of Jacob that occur between wives actually mark political divisions. Maternal ancestry creates hierarchies between the tribes of Israel that will compete to lead the nation. In a very real sense, this story records the journey of Israel's eponymous ancestor, Jacob, into exile. He leaves his homeland a single man, fleeing for his life. And while in exile, he puts down roots, marries 4 women, has 11 of his 12 sons and a daughter. He also becomes rich in cattle and flocks. When he ultimately returns to Canaan, it is under the guidance and at the call of the Israelite God. And before reaching the land of Canaan, he camps on the eastern side of the river Jordan, spending a night alone. And it is here, just outside the land, where Jacob wrestles with a mysterious man and is renamed Israel. The identity of the midnight wrestler remains obscure. He refuses to give his name to Jacob, and while he is referred to as a man, Jacob ultimately concludes that he has wrestled with none other than God. He names the place of this encounter Peniel, meaning face of God.
So remember, she talked about this in another one of her videos, and remember I said to put a pin in it. Put another pin by the fact that he would not tell her his name.
Because he says, I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved. And so the process through which Jacob has become Israel has been a long and arduous one. It has involved fleeing, exile, and hard labor. It has also involved fulfilling one of the patriarchal promises as Jacob becomes a great nation through the birth of his 12 sons. Now that he is Israel and no longer Jacob, he crosses the river Jordan, returning to the land of Canaan, returning to the place where he has been promised a perpetual land holding. From the perspective of a people exiled from their land, living in Mesopotamia, the story of Jacob would be a powerful story of redemption. The tribe of Judah, who ends up in exile in Babylonia, will likewise endure hard labor. They will take wives and build families, replenishing themselves into something resembling a great nation. Many will also build wealth in the land to which they are exiled, and when they return to the land of Judah during the Persian period, they return not as Judah, but as Israel. They too are renamed before crossing the River Jordan back into the Promised Land. In our next lecture, we'll turn to the second family story in the Torah, the story of Moses, a divinely chosen leader who leads the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt to the very threshold of the Promised Land.
Okay, so there we are. She didn't go into Genesis as much as I would have liked her to. So what I'm going to do is there are a lot of things in Genesis about Abraham, some about Isaac, and maybe some about Jacob that I think are kind of amazing. And so I am going to put those together in another video and post that for you guys for next week. And then in 2 weeks from this week, we will come back and we will get into the story of Moses, which I am excited to get into. Thank you guys so much for coming back this evening. Like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. And I will see you. Oh, homework. We don't really have a homework assignment for tonight. I guess just research that weak eyes um, phrase. Let's find out where it is in the Bible. Let's find out what exactly those words mean. And let's see if we can figure out if that means she was ugly or if she had some kind of eye condition, you know? So, okay. See you guys in 2 weeks.